Chapter 11, The Lombards in Italy and the Rise of the Papacy 568–653 by Charles Oman. The wanderings of the Lombards. Albin conquers northern Italy. His tragic end: anarchy among the Lombard dukes, reign of Othari and Frankish wars, conquest and conversion of Agilulf, Rothari the lawgiver, state of Rome and Italy, career of St. Gregory. He founds the temporal power of the papacy. In the 3rd year of Justin Roman II, and only 15 years after Narses had swept the Goth and Frank out of Italy, a new horde of barbarians came pouring down on that unhappy land. The ravages of 18 years of war and a terrible pestilence which supervened had left all the northern parts of the peninsula desolate and well-nigh uninhabited. The land seemed to have sunk back into primeval silence and solitude. The imperial troops held a few strong places beyond the Po, such as Verona and Pavia, but had made no effort to restore the military frontier along the Alps, and the land lay open to the spoiler. Southern Italy had suffered less, and Ravenna was still strong and well guarded, but the Transpadine lowlands, destined ere long to change their name to the Lombard plain, were as destitute of civil population as they were of military resources. The new invaders of Italy were the Lombards, Langobardi, a Teutonic people who, according to their ancient tribal legends, had once dwelt in Scandinavia, but had descended 10 generations before into northern Germany, and from thence had slowly worked their way down to the Danube. They had only come into touch with the frontier of the empire when Odoacer smote the Rugii in 487. After that tribe had been scattered, they moved into its abiding place on the mid-Danube and became the neighbours of the Ostrogoths and the Gepidi. The Lombards were the least tinctured with civilization of all the Teutonic tribes, even more barbarous, it would seem, than our own Saxon forefathers. Living far back in the darkness of the north, they had been kept from any knowledge of Roman culture, and did not even approach the boundaries of the empire till it had already been broken up and laid desolate. They were still heathen, and still living in the stage of primitive tribal life which Tacitus painted in the Germania. They were divided into many tribal families, or clans, which they called faras, and their subdivisions were ruled by elective aldermen or dukes, but the whole nation chose its king from among the royal houses of the Lethings and Gungings, who claimed to descend from Gambara, the wise queen who had led the race across the Baltic from Scandinavia 10 generations back. During the times of Justinian's Ostrogothic War, the Lombards were under the rule of Audun, whom Narses bribed with great gifts to aid him against Baduila. 5,000 warriors, under the command of their king himself, joined Narses in the invasion of Italy in 552, and took a distinguished part in the victory of Tagini. It must have been in this campaign that the Lombards learnt of the fertility and the weakness of Italy. But they were still engaged in wars with their neighbours on the Danube, and their king was an old man, wherefore we need not think it strange that they waited 15 years before they turned their knowledge to account. The Lombards were the close neighbours and the bitter foes of the Gepidi, the Gothic tribe who had remained behind in the Hungarian plains when the other sections of the Goths moved westward to Spain and Italy. Wars of Albin, the long struggle between Lombard and Gepid, only came to an end in 567, when the Lombards called in to their aid the Tartar race of the Avars, and by their assistance almost entirely exterminated the Gepidi, whose scattered remnant only survived as slaves of the conquering horde. By this time Albin, the son of Audun, was reigning over the Lombards. He it was who slew with his own hand Cunimund, the king of the Gepidi. The barbarous victor struck off the head of his enemy, and had the skull mounted in gold, and fashioned into a drinking cup as the supreme token of his triumph. Yet but a short time before, ere the last struggle had begun between the Lombards and the Gepidi, he had taken to wife Rosamund, the daughter of the man whom he now slew and beheaded. The Lombard kings in Italy. Having ended this great national feud by the extermination of the Gepidi, Albin determined to put into effect a scheme which must have been long maturing in his brain, the conquest of Italy. The Lombard historian of a later day asserted that he had been tempted to the invasion by the treachery of Narses, who, in discontent with Justin II, had urged Albin to invade the peninsula and sent him as gift samples of all the generous fruits and wines that Italy produces. But this is the mere echo of a Lombard saga. Narses, now over 80 years of age and on his deathbed, had other matters to think about than the spiting of his new master. Nor did the Lombards, who had ridden all over Italy in 552, need to be reminded of its existence or its fertility. Before leaving Pannonia, Albin made over his old kingdom to his allies the Avars, only stipulating that it should be restored to him if ever he returned from Italy. A rather futile compact to make with such a faithless race as this Tartar horde. Crossing the Corinthian Alps in the summer of 568, the whole Lombard nation, men, women, and children, with their cattle and slaves, descended into the Venetian plains and spread themselves over the deserted lands. There was hardly any opposition. In cities that had once been great, like Aquileia and Milan, the scanty population did not even close the gates, but awaited the invader with apathy. Only the places where there was an imperial garrison offered resistance. Verona, protected by the rushing Adige, Padua in its marshes, and Pavia, the ancient royal city of the Goths, were among the few towns that refused to admit the Lombards. Albin conquers northern Italy. The newcomers spread themselves over the whole valley of the Po, as far as the Tuscan Apennines and the gates of Ravenna, and begun to settle down on the fairest spots among the ruined Roman villages. They divided themselves, like the Franks in Gaul or the East Angles in Britain, into two folks, the Neustrian or Western and the Austrian or Eastern Lombards. The former stretched from the Cottian Alps to the Adda, the latter from the Adda to the Julian Alps. Piedmont formed the bulk of Neustria, Venetia the bulk of Austria. Many scattered portions of tribes came to join Albin in his new conquest. Not only did he grant lands to broken bands of Saxons and Swabians, but even foreigners, such as Bulgarians and Slavs, found shelter with him. While Albin was founding the new kingdom of Lombardy, the cities which at first resisted began to drop into his hands. Verona fell early, but Pavia made a long defense. So desperately did it hold out against the host left to blockade it that the king swore in his wrath to slay every living thing within its walls. But when, after 3 years, the starving citizens threw open their gates, he relented of his hard vow, because there was much Christian folk in that city, and made Pavia his capital and royal stronghold. In the next year, however, he came to his end. The Lombard chronicler, Paul the Deacon, repeating some familiar Lombard saga, tells the grim tale of his death thus. King Albin sat over long at the wine in his city of Verona, so that he grew boisterous, and he sent for the cup which he had made from the skull of King Cunimund, his father-in-law, and forced his queen, Rosamund, to drink from it, bidding her drink joyfully with her father. Then the queen conceived a deep grief and anger in her heart, and questioned with herself how she might avenge her father by slaying her husband. So she strove to persuade Helmiches, the king's armor-bearer, who was also his foster brother, to slay his lord. And Helmiches would not, but counselled her to win Perideo, the strongest champion of the Lombards, to do the deed. Murder of Albin. Then Rosamund sold her honour to Perideo, and became his mistress, and said to him, Now hast thou done a thing for which either thou must kill Albin, or he thee. So he unwillingly consented to the deed, and at midday, when all the palace lay asleep, Rosamund bound the king's sword so tightly to the bed head that it could not be drawn, and then bid Perideo go in and slay her husband. When Albin heard an armed man enter, he sprang from his couch and strove to draw his sword without avail. For some space he fought hard for his life with a stool that he caught up, but what could the best of warriors do without arms against an armed champion? He was slain like a weakling, and after passing unharmed through so many battles, died by the counsel of one woman, and she his own wife. So the Lombards took up his body with much weeping, and buried it beneath the great flight of steps over against the palace, where it lay till my own days. May 572. Helmiches strove in vain to make himself king in his master's room, but the Lombards would have none of him, and he was forced to fly with Rosamund and the murderer Perideo, to take shelter with the Romans at Ravenna. There all three of them came to evil ends, for the hand of heaven was upon them for doing such a foul deed. Meanwhile the Lombards crowned as king in the room of Albin Clefo, one of the mightiest of their dukes, though not of the royal blood, for Albin had no son and was the last of the Lethings. Clefo completed the conquest of all northern Italy, as far as the southern limits of Tuscany and the gates of Ravenna. Anarchy, 573–83. But ere he had reigned a year he was slain by one of his own slaves whom he had wronged. After he was dead the Lombards chose no more kings to reign over them for 10 years, but each tribe went forth conquering and plundering under its own elective duke. It is said that no less than 35 of these chiefs were ranging over Italy at the same time, 573–83. Nothing can show better the survival of primitive Teutonic ideas among the Lombards than this period of anarchy. They had not yet learned to look upon the king as a necessary part of the constitution of the tribe, but, like the Germans of the 1st century, regarded him as a war chief, to be followed in time of peril alone. The Goths or the Franks, who had advanced to a further stage, could not have borne to live kingless for 10 whole years. Strangely enough, the loss of their supreme head seems to have detracted in no wise from the warlike vigour of the Lombards. In the 10 kingless years they went on subduing the land, and pushed their incursions farther to the west and south. 3 dukes of Neustria crossed the Alps and harried Provence, then in the hands of King Guntram the Frank, the peaceful brother of the warlike Sigebert and the wicked Chilperic. They took many cities, and were only driven out of the land after much fighting by Mummalus, the great Gallo-Roman general, who served King Guntram so well. But for him, Provence might have become part of Lombardy. Meanwhile, other Lombard dukes were pressing southward down the Italian peninsula. They did not act on any combined plan of invasion, but each passed on with his war band, leaving to right and to left many cities held by imperialist garrisons, till he found a place of settlement that pleased his eye. Hence it came to pass that Lombard duchies and Roman cities were curiously intermixed. In central Italy, Farold, the first Duke of Sparleto, left Ravenna and Ancona to the north, and established himself in the central valley of the Tiber, with imperialist garrisons all around him. Zato, the first Duke of Benevento, passed even farther to the south, and founded a realm in the Samnite valleys, which was almost entirely out of touch with the other Lombard states. It was hemmed in to east and west by the Roman garrisons of Rome, Naples, and Calabria. The Dukes of Lucca and Chiusi, who held the bulk of Tuscany, did not push their limits down to the Tiber, but stopped short at the Ciminian hills, leaving a considerable district north of Rome in the hands of the imperialists. Even in northern Italy, the Dukes of Neustria left Genoa and the Ligurian coast alone, and those of Austria did not subdue the marshland of Mantua and Padua, nor follow the fugitive inhabitants of Venetia into the islands where Venice and Grado were just beginning to grow up in the security of the lagoons. All over Italy, Lombard and Roman districts were hopelessly confused, and save that the Po Valley was wholly Lombard, and Bruttium and Calabria wholly Roman, there was no part of the land that was not shared between the invader and the old imperial government. Coming into a country already desolate and well-nigh dispeopled, and bringing with them the customs of primitive Germany, untinctured with any Roman intermixture, the Lombards established a polity even less centralized than that of the Visigoths, and infinitely below the standard of government which Theodoric had once set up in Italy 80 years before, the Lombard monarchy. When the nation once more chose a king, his power was hopelessly circumscribed by the authority of the great hereditary dukes. Sparleto and Benevento hardly paid even a nominal homage to the king who reigned at Pavia. Only when he presented himself with a large army in central Italy could he hope to win attention for his orders. Even in the valley of the Po and in Tuscany, his power was very imperfect. The authority of the royal name had been fatally injured by the extinction with Alboin of the ancient kingly house of the Lethings. The Lombard monarchs, like their Visigothic contemporaries in Spain, only held their crown when once they had been elected by the right of the sword. In a short history of 200 years, the Lombard kingdom saw 9 successive races of kings mount the throne. All represented old ducal families. The rulers of Turin, Brescia, Benevento, Friuli and Istria, all at one time or another, won the royal crown, besides 2 or 3 kings who were not even Lombards by birth, but strangers from the neighbouring land of Bavaria. In the wasted regions of northern Italy, it would seem that the Lombards formed for some time the large majority of the population. Unlike the Goths in Spain or the Franks in central Gaul, they did not merely consist of a few scattered families lost among the masses of the old inhabitants. There is a greater breach in the old Roman traditions of municipal and social life in the valley of the Po than in most of the other lands of the Western Empire. In the 7th century, Lombardy must have preserved less traces of its ancient imperial organization than Spain, Gaul, or Burgundy, and must have presented a much more primitive and Teutonic aspect. This is as we should expect, from the fact that the Lombards came from the very back of Germany, and first met with the influence of the older world of Rome when they moved into Italy. Italy in A. Outside the Po Valley, however, Italy was in a very different state. Southern Italy and much of central Italy preserved its ancient organization almost undisturbed. The Exarchate of Ravenna, the Ducatus Romanus, and the southern peninsulas of Apulia and Bruttium remained unchanged down to the 9th century. Records show us in the neighbourhood of Rome the old social organization of the land, in domains inhabited by coloni, and owned by Roman church corporations, or absentee proprietors, at a time when in the northern plains the feudal system of the semi-independent dukes, each surrounded by their landholding Carmites, was in full operation. In organization, no less than in blood, northern Italy and southern Italy were fatally sundered, and two nations differing in all their usages of life and manners of thought were growing up. The parts of Italy which remained under the imperial scepter and preserved their ancient social and political organization were strangely scattered. In the reign of Maurice, 582–602, the emperor was still obeyed in 8 regions. First was the Istrian peninsula, and the marsh and lagoon islands of the Venetian coast, with the strong cities of Padua and Mantua thrust inland like a wedge into the side of Lombardy. Second came the Ligurian coast with the city of Genoa, crushed in between the Apennines and the sea. Its rugged valleys and cliffs did not yet tempt the Lombards out of their smiling plain to court the neighborhood of the sea, for the Lombards were essentially unmaritime, imperial possessions in Italy. Third is found the tract of land round Ravenna, the Exarchate as it now became called, a title which it shared for a space with Africa, where exarchs also reigned. The Exarchate stretched along the coast of the Adriatic, from the delta of the Po up to the gates of Rimini, reaching as far inland as the Apennines, and comprising the whole southern half of the ancient province of Emilia. Farther down the coast lay the 4th imperial district, from Rimini to Ancona, which was often called the Pentapolis and the Decapolis, from 2 groups of 5 and 10 cities respectively which it contained. In Umbria lay a 5th detached district where the emperor was still acknowledged. It centered around Perugia, and was much hemmed in by the Lombard duchies of Chiusi and Sparlido, but it stretched out one horn toward the Pentapolis on the north, and the other toward Rome on the south. The 6th district was the Roman territory, now known as the Ducatus Romanus, from the dux who acted as civil governor in the ancient city, in subordination to the exarch at Ravenna. The Roman duchy reached from Civita Vecchia to Terracina, and from the Apennines to the sea, taking in the southern corner of Etruria, and well nigh the whole of Latium. It was cut off by the Lombard town of Capua from the Duchy of Naples, a narrow coast strip containing the towns of Naples and Amalfi, and ruled by a duke resident in the larger place. Lastly, all the toe and heel of Italy, Calabria, Bruttium and southern Lucania, the whole coastline from Brindisi to Policastro, formed the 8th Roman district. It was evident that the administration of such a number of fragmentary possessions would be a hard task for the exarch, cut off as he was from access by land to the greater part of the regions for which he was responsible. It was not so easy to foresee that the main result of the scission of Italy by the Lombard conquests was destined to be the rise of the temporal power of the Papacy, that most unexpected of the developments of the 7th century. After the anarchy under the tribal dukes had lasted 10 years, the Lombards chose them another king. The election seems to have been made mainly under the pressure of the war with the Franks, which they had brought upon themselves by their reckless invasion and ravaging of Provence in 574–75. Guntram of Burgundy induced his Austrasian kinsmen to help him, and the Lombards were attacked by the Austrasians, who descended the valley of the Adige and attacked Trent, as well as by the Burgundians. Moreover, Tiberius II of Constantinople had sent gifts to the kings of the Franks in order to induce them to aid him in Italy, and had done what he could, while the Persian and Avaric wars still dragged on, to send help to the exarch of Ravenna. The new Lombard king was Othari, the son of that Clefo whose murder had left the throne vacant in 573. So greatly was the need of providing for the maintenance of the central power felt, that the dukes not only did him homage, and ceded him the royal city of Pavia, but promised him a half of all the lands that were in their hands as a royal domain to maintain him, his comitatus and his officers. We may doubt if the promise was very exactly kept, nor did all the dukes unite in the election. The first act of King Othari had to be to subdue and expel Duke Drachtulf, who had called in the Romans, and fortified himself in Brescello to defend the middle valley of the Po against the king. Wars of Othari, 580–390. For the whole of his reign Othari was involved in recurring struggles with the Franks, whose young and warlike king, Childebert II, the son of Brunhildes, was set on resuming the schemes of his cousin Theudebert for conquering Italy. The 7 years' reign of Othari was mainly occupied in warding off Frankish attacks on Italy. Guntram and Childebert, stirred up by Smaragdus, the exarch of Ravenna, threatened 3 or 4 times to cross the Alps, and twice actually invaded Lombardy. The more dangerous assault was in 590, when 2 great armies advanced simultaneously, the one from Burgundy over the Cenis against Milan, the other from Austrasia over the Brenner against Trent and Verona. Both forced their way to their goal, and did much damage to the Lombards, but they failed to meet with each other, or with the Roman troops which the exarch had promised to bring to their aid. Famine and pestilence thinned their ranks, and they could not reach the Lombard king, who had shut himself up in the impregnable Pavia. At last they returned each to their own land, without profiting in the least by their great expedition. In the intervals between the Frankish invasions, Othari had done something to consolidate the Lombard power in North Italy, by capturing the great lagoon fortress of Comacchio, whose seizure cut the communication between Padua and Ravenna. At about the same time Farold, Duke of Sparlido, took Classis, the seaport of Ravenna, and completely destroyed the city, whose only surviving remnant, the solitary church of St. Apollinaire in Classe, stands up in such forlorn grandeur in the Ravenese marshes. Othari is said to have pushed one plundering expedition through Benevento into Bruttium, to have ridden to the extreme south point of the Italian peninsula, and to have touched with his spear a sea-swept pillar near Reggio, crying, "Here shall be the boundary of the kingdom of the Lombards." A vain boast if it was ever made, for Bruttium was not destined to fall at any time into Lombard hands. Othari married Theodelinda, the daughter of Garibold, Duke of Bavaria, a pious Christian and a Catholic, whose coming seems to have led the wild Lombards to Christianity, much as the influence of Queen Bertha worked on the Jutes of Kent. She had not been long wedded to him when he died. The Lombard Witan, who had formed a high idea of her wisdom and virtue, consulted her as to the choice of a new king. She recommended to them Agilulf, Duke of Turin, a cousin of Othari. To him she gave her hand, and he was at the same time raised on the shield at Milan as King of the Lombards, 590. Agilulf was led by his wife's persuasion to be baptized, and ere long the greater part of the nation followed his example. The majority of the Lombards, like most of the other Teutonic races, adopted Arianism, and only conformed to orthodoxy in the 7th century. It was Agilulf and Theodelinda who built the famous Basilica of Monza, where the Iron Crown of Lombardy is even now preserved. In its sacristy are still shown many relics of the pious queen. Most curious among them is a hen and chickens of gold of the most quaint and archaic workmanship, a marvelous example of the earliest art of a Teutonic people just emerging from barbarism. With it is preserved the crown of Agilulf, which he dedicated to St. John, and which bears the inscription, Agilulf gratiadivirgilorus rex totius itali, OFFERT, SANCTO, IOHN and IBAPTISTA in ICCLSIA MODICI. The first 3 kings of the Lombards had been short-lived, but Agilulf survived for the respectable term of 25 years, 590-1616, and reigned long enough to see his son grow up and become his colleague on the throne. More fortunate than his predecessor Othari, he was delivered from the danger of Frankish invasions by the series of wars between the sons of Brunhildes and Fredegundes, which broke out in 593, and afterwards by the home troubles of Austrasia and Burgundy, caused by the strife between Brunhildes and the great nobles. Conquests of Agilulf. Agilulf was, therefore, enabled to lop away from the empire several of the detached districts which had hitherto adhered to it. For the greater part of his reign he was in constant war with the Romans, and stripped the exarchs of Sutrium, Ort, Tudor, Perugia, and other South Tuscan and Umbrian towns, 598. By the mediation of Pope Gregory, the greater treaty was, for the first time, concluded between the Lombards and the Empire in 599, but the exarch Gallicinus broke the peace, by seizing the person of Agilulf's daughter as she chanced to be passing through imperial territory. This second Lombard war, which fell into the reign of Phocas, proved most disastrous for the Romans. Agilulf began by capturing Padua, the great fortress of the Venetian marshes, 602. The fall of Padua cut off Mantua from succor, and that city, the last stronghold of the empire in the interior of Lombardy, also fell in 602. The ministers of Phocas only obtained a final pacification in 605 by promising to pay an annual tribute of 1,200 gold solidi and ceding the South Tuscan strongholds of Orvieto and Bagnaria. There was no more fight left in emperor or exarch for many a year. In the throes of the disastrous Persian War, Phocas and Heraclius were unable to send aid to Rome or Ravenna. The opportunity afforded to Agilulf of completing the conquest of Italy was such as never occurred again. But contented with his annual tribute, and perhaps tamed down by approaching old age, the Lombard king remained quiescent. Apparently he preferred to give his realm peace, and to occupy himself in keeping down his unruly dukes. In the course of his reign there were 3 or 4 dangerous rebellions of these chiefs, but Agilulf put them all down, apparently without much difficulty. There was also trouble on the northeastern frontier from the Avars and Slavs, the same foes who were so grievously afflicting the Roman Empire at this time. The Slavs made their way into Istria and Scilly, and became troublesome neighbours to Italy, though some of their nearest tribes were reduced to pay tribute by the Dukes of Friuli. The Avars were more active and more dangerous. In spite of repeated treaties with Agilulf, their Chagan burst into North Italy in 610, slew Gisulf, Duke of Friuli, in battle, ravaged all Venetia, and carried off many captives. Fortunately for the Lombards, these invasions were not continued, as the Avars found better prey and less fighting in the Balkan peninsula. In spite of such troubles, the reign of Agilulf was a time of growth, expansion, and ripening civilization for the Lombards. They had all, by the end of his reign, received Christianity, had settled down in their new home, and were beginning to build churches and palaces, instead of confining their attention to destroying them. Agilulf had found a modus vivendi with Gregory the Great and the Papacy, and taught his subjects to live in some sort of peace with their neighbours, instead of persisting in the unending war which had filled the first 30 years of Lombard dominion in Italy. Agilulf was succeeded by his only son Adalald, a boy of 14, whom he had induced the Lombard Witan to salute as his colleague, and raise on the shield some years before. The regency was held by Queen Theodelinda, who was both pious and popular, till the young king came of age. But soon after he had attained his majority, Adalald was stricken with madness, and the nation chose in his stead Ariol, Duke of Turin, who appears to have been no kinsman of the royal house, but had married the young king's sister, Gundeberga, 626. Little is known of this king's reign of 12 years. We hear neither of wars with the Franks nor of conquests from the Roman. We only read that he was, unlike his predecessor, an Arian. When he died, however, he was succeeded by a ruler of far greater mark, Duke Rothari of Brescia, of the race of Arad, a strong man, and one who walked in the paths of justice, though he was not an orthodox Christian, but followed the deceitful heresy of the Arians. Conquests of Rothari, 630–652. Rothari finally completed the conquest of northern Italy by taking the 2 districts which had still remained in the hands of the imperialists down to his day. He subdued the whole Ligurian coast from Nice to Luna, with the great city of Genoa its capital, 641. He also took the city of Oderzo, the last mainland possession of the Romans in Venetia. After this time, the Lagoon Islands alone acknowledged the Eastern Caesar as their suzerain, and their homage was formal rather than real. Rothari's conquests were not won without severe fighting. His greatest victory was won on the Scultenna, not far from Modena, over the exarch Plato, who had invaded Lombard territory, but was defeated with a loss of 8,000 men, and driven back into Ravenna. The new activity of the Romans, to which this battle bears witness, may be attributed to the fact that the Persian and Saracen wars of Heraclius were at last ended, and under his grandson, Constans II, the Eastern Empire was beginning to recover some measure of strength, 642. Laws of Rothari. But Rothari is better remembered as the framer of the Lombard Code of Laws than as the conqueror of Liguria. In 643, he published the compilation of the traditional usages of the nation, which had hitherto never been committed to writing. It is noticeable that the code is promulgated, not on the king's personal authority, but like the English laws of Inni, pro communi gentes nostri utilitate, pari concilio parit consensu cum primatis judicibus nostris cunctoque felicissimo exercidu nostro, that is to say, by the king, with the council of his witan, and the assent of the armed folkmoot of the Lombard nation. The Edictum Rotharis is a very primitive body of legislation, such as might have been promulgated in the depths of the German forests, instead of in the heart of Italy. It is mainly composed of elaborate lists of weregelds, of laws against armed violence, of rules of inheritance, of statements concerning the obligation of the follower towards his lord, of provisions for judicial duels per campionum. There is hardly any mention either of things ecclesiastical or of city life, merely a provision against breach of peace in a church, and some rules about magistry comaisances or skilled Roman artisans. We have from the laws a picture of a people dwelling apart by families or faras, each in its own farm clearing, surrounded by woods or open pasture land. Some are free Lombards, called even thus early barons, others the men of a duke or of the king. Below them are Aldii, who correspond to medieval villeins, the half-free occupiers of the land of the Lombard master. These, no doubt, are the remains of the old Roman population, coloni who had once cultivated the maser of a Roman curiales. The royal authority is found relegated to the local dukes in all military matters, while civil affairs are dealt with by the king's schultheiss, or reeve, as the Old English would have called him, or to the castaldus, who seems to have been the king's representative in the city, as opposed to the countryside. It is noticeable, as showing the extremely un-Roman character of the Lombard laws, that they are drawn up by a German official, the notary Ansold, not by a Roman bishop or lawyer, as would certainly have been the case in Gaul or Spain. Their execrable Latin, which makes light of all concords or rules of government of prepositions, could not have been the work of any educated Italian. With the death of Rothari in 652, began a time of trouble and confusion for the Lombards, in which they ceased to win ground from the Romans and fell into civil strife and anarchy. It commenced by the murder of Rothari's son, Rodald, after he had reigned less than 6 months. He was a prince of licentious manners, and fell a victim to the dagger of an outraged husband, 653. The 80 years of Italian history during which the Lombards were settling down in the valley of the Po, and along the Umbrian and Samnite slopes of the Apennines, have won their chief importance in the story of the world, not from the doings of Agilulf or Rothari, but from the events that were taking place in Rome. To these years we may ascribe the foundation of the temporal power of the papacy, and the development of the ecumenical position of the Bishop of Rome to an extent which had hitherto been uncontemplated. These movements owe most of their strength to a single man, Pope Gregory the Great. After the first shock of the Lombard invasion had rent Italy in twain, the imperial governors resolved to take up their residence in Ravenna, not in Rome, in the capital of the Italy of Theodoric, not that of the Italy of Augustus. Rise of the papacy. They chose the strong marsh fortress close to the Lombard border, not the decayed city of the Tiber, still scarred by the traces of Baduila's harrying. The exarch stationed himself at Ravenna, and delegated his civil and military authority in the scattered portions of imperial Italy to minor officials, of whom the duces of Rome and Naples were the chief. This removal of the seat of the viceroy from the ancient metropolis was destined to have the most far-reaching results. Its first was that the chief lay official in Rome was an individual of far less authority and prestige than the chief ecclesiastical personage there resident. The bishops of Rome had always been men of importance. Their claim to a patriarchal primacy over all the western seas of Europe had already been formulated. In the ancient civil prefecture of Italy, that is, in the Italian peninsula, Africa and Illyricum, it had much reality. The African and Dalmatian churches referred matters of difficulty to Rome for decision, no less than did the Church of Italy. We find Gregory the Great exercising a real influence in places as distant as Salona, Larissa, and Carthage. During the existence of the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, the popes had obtained a kind of recognition from the Teutonic kings as the accredited representatives of the Catholic and Roman population of Italy. They were certainly the most important subjects of the realm outside the ranks of the Gothic conquerors, and were allowed to petition or plead with the king in behalf of all the Catholic Italians. The reconquest of Italy by Justinian had threatened to lower the prestige and power of the popes, by placing them once more under a master who was both the legitimate ruler of the whole empire and an orthodox Catholic. Justinian had dealt in a very autocratic manner with the Roman bishops, as the tales of the woes of Vigilius and Silverius show. He summoned them to Constantinople, bullied, imprisoned, or tried them at his good pleasure. The continued survival of the imperial power in Italy would have checked the growth of papal authority in a great measure. But the Lombard invasion changed the aspect of affairs. The imperial governors and garrisons were swept into corners of the peninsula, and the popes left without any master on the spot to curb them. The unfortunate Eastern wars of Maurice, Phocas, and Heraclius prevented them from turning any adequate attention to Italy. They sent the exarchs over to make what fight they could, without giving them adequate supplies, either of men or money. The exarchs penned up in Ravenna could only communicate with Rome with the greatest difficulty. The land route of communication was almost cut by the Lombards of Spoleto. The sea route was long and difficult. Hence Rome was left to itself, to fall or stand by its own strength and its own counsel. The Pope and the Duke of Rome were continually thrown upon their own resources, without the power of asking advice or aid, either from the Emperor or the Exarch. For 27 years, as Pope Gregory once wrote, Rome was continually in imminent peril of Lombard conquest, 572-599, and obliged to provide for itself. In this time of stress and storm, the popes won their first secular authority over Rome and its vicinity, and reduced the civil magistrates to a place of quite secondary importance. Gregory the Great, 596–04. The man to whom the increase in the power of the papacy was mainly due was Pope Gregory the Great, whose sway of 14 years, 596–04, covers the second half of the reign of Maurice and the first 2 years of Phocas. Gregory was a man of exceptional capacity and of exceptional opportunities, at once administrator, diplomatist, monk, and saint. He was a noble Roman who had spent his early manhood in the civil service and had risen to the rank of prefect of the city. In early middle age, he suddenly cast secular things aside, employed his wealth to found monasteries, and entered one himself as a simple monk. He plunged into the most rigid extremes of asceticism, and almost killed himself by his perpetual macerations of the flesh. Ere long he became abbot, and signalized himself by the stringent discipline which he maintained over his monks, as well as by his fiery zeal and untiring charity. It was at this time of his life that there occurred the scene so well known to all English readers. When he found the Northumbrian boys exposed for sale in the marketplace of Rome, he conceived pity in his heart for the uncared-for heathen of Britain, and determined to cross the northern seas and bear the gospel to the Saxon and Angle. But Pope Pelagius Roman II interfered to prevent the most able, as well as the most saintly, of his clergy from leaving the service of the Roman See, and risking his life among the pagans. He forbade Gregory's departure for England, and sent him instead to represent the papacy at the court of Constantinople. A few years after his return from this mission, which was long enough to enable him to get a clear view of the weakness of the Emperor Maurice, and of his impotence to interfere in Italian matters, Gregory was chosen Bishop of Rome, when Pelagius died of the plague, 590. Gregory was elected without the imperial sanction. Rome was so closely beset by the Lombards that there was neither time nor means for asking Maurice's consent, but the emperor afterwards confirmed the elevation of the saintly abbot. All Italy, nay, even the whole of the Christian West, knew of him already as the most prominent of the Roman clergy, and he was able at once to assume a position of great independence and authority. Gregory's most striking feature was his extraordinary self-confidence and conviction in the absolute wisdom and righteousness of his own ideas. The legend, started by his admirers not long after his death, to the effect that he was actually inspired by the Holy Ghost, who visited him in the form of a dove, very adequately represents his own notion of his infallibility. It was this self-confidence which enabled him to take up the line of stern and unbending autocracy which he always adopted. Other men were mute and obedient before the imperious saint, in whom they recognized their moral superior. Few, save the Emperor Maurice and the fanatical John the Faster, Patriarch of Constantinople, ever ventured to confront or withstand him. Unquestionably he was the most able, and one of the best-intentioned men of his age. He left his mark on all that he touched, from the conversion of the English and the Lombards down to the official music of the Western Church, the Gregorian chants that still preserve his name. Although posterity enshrined him as one of the 4 great doctors of the Latin Church, his theological work was the weakest part of his activity. His writings are full of tropes, far-fetched conceits, misinterpretation of Scripture. He was ignorant of Hebrew and even of Greek, and pedantic arguments from analogy. It was as statesman and administrator, and fosterer of missionary work that Gregory was truly great. In Rome, he ruled as a temporal governor rather than a bishop. It was he who provided against the attacks of the Lombards, arrayed soldiers for the defense of the walls, fed the starving people from the funds of the church, and negotiated with the chiefs of the enemy in behalf of the people of the Ducatus Romanus. In 592 he concluded on his own authority a truce with the Duke of Spoleto, while the exarch was set on continuing the war. Maurice stigmatized this conduct as fatuous, but, as the emperor left Rome to provide for itself, he should hardly have complained. Secular activity of Gregory. In another crisis, Gregory appointed on his own authority a tribune to command the garrison of Naples, and a governor for the Tuscan town of Nepi. Finally, it was he who in 599 negotiated the treaty of peace with King Agilulf, which ended the 30 years of continuous war which had followed the first coming of the Lombards to Italy. When rebuked by the exarch, he claimed to take precedence of him, not only in virtue of his priestly office, but also in place and dignity. In short, for all practical purposes, Gregory made himself the half-independent governor of Rome. But Gregory's progress in asserting his authority as Patriarch of the West was even more important than his advances toward temporal power. He it was who recovered Spain and Britain for the Catholic Church, the former by the conversion of record from Arianism, 32, the latter by sending the mission of St. Augustine to Kent, and obtaining the baptism of King Ethelbert. Through the influence of Queen Theodelinda, he obtained control over the Lombard King Agilulf, and induced him to bring up his son Adalald as a Catholic. Justly then may Gregory be styled the first patriarch of the United West. His successors were, for many generations, not men of mark, but by his work he had gained for them a temporal authority and a spiritual precedence which they were never again to lose. When he died in 604, he left the Roman See exalted to a pitch of greatness which it had never before known, revered by all the Teutonic peoples of Europe, and half freed from its allegiance to the rulers of Constantinople.